This is the story of a fundamental change in the nature of labor in early Virginia. Virginia, of course, was dominated by tobacco. That was the economic driver of this colony. Now, let's begin the story with former indentured servants. These are people who have been treated very badly and they're getting disillusioned. They're getting extremely angry and upset. Uh, they had hoped to become planters themselves by buying land, but land prices were going up because tobacco was such a lucrative crop. And only the poorer land was left as the population increased and they moved farther and farther from the coast. Uh, and this land often bordered on, uh, encroached on, interfered with Native Americans' lands, and the Native Americans sometimes attacked these English settlers. Now, the result was anger, a lot of it directed in two places, in two directions. One, they're angry at the Native Americans who were sometimes attacking them. And secondly, they were angry at the planters. A planter is a large, rich landowner because the planters had mistreated them horribly when they were indentured servants. They were treated like dirt. And they often left them after they finished their term of servitude with poorer land far from Jamestown, where transportation was more expensive and more difficult, and they had to worry about attacks from Native Americans. Now, in 1676, all this came to a head with a rebellion led by Nathaniel Bacon. Um, Living conditions after about the mid-17th century were better. So now more and more of these former indentured servants were living for a long time after they were freed. The early servants were much more likely to have died before they even finished their term of service. And a lot of the rebels who acted in Bacon's rebellion were these former indentured servants. They had weapons, which were part of life in Virginia for hunting game, for protecting against attacks. Uh, so they attacked in two directions. They attacked Native Americans, and they also burned the capital city of Jamestown, where these planters, where the money and power was centralized in early Virginia. Now, this is important. They had some alliances with Africans, whether those Africans were slaves or indentured servants or free. They, in some cases, allied with these rebels. And as a result, the planters were terrified. Now, it's very important to understand why these rich planters were so terrified. The question came down to this: how will Virginia society be organized? If it's organized by class, then you had indentured servants and Africans ganging up against the planters, and this put the planters in a minority. But if they could change the way these poor whites would see things, then they could organize society not on the basis of economic class, but on the basis of race. And this would be whites versus blacks, and now the whites would be in a majority. Now, it's pretty obvious which of these served the interests of planters better. If they could organize it by race, then they were once again in the majority. Now, here's a way of diagramming it. If it's rich versus poor, and this would include the poor of both races, then the planters were in a minority. Now, what did the planters really want here? Well, they wanted a reliable labor force. Their wealth depended on people who could provide all the difficult, hard work of producing and processing that tobacco. They wanted a labor force ideally that did not have weapons, that would never own land, so then they don't have to satisfy the needs of these former servants for land, that would never be free. In a labor force whose descendants, sons, daughters, grandsons, granddaughters would also work for the planters. And on top of all that, it would be nice if they had a labor force that could easily be identified simply by the color of their skin. You see where this is going. The perfect solution from their point of view is African slaves. Now, they still had to remake Virginia society. They had to remake the way that these poor whites were thinking. And here's how they did that. They convinced them that they were superior. As a very well-known writer and speaker, Tim Wise, has said, this was a matter of rich white people convincing poor white people to blame their troubles on black and brown people. And this same pattern continues to exist right to the present day. That helps to define how politics is conducted in this country and to define the attitudes that a lot of white Americans have about minority groups. You see that in the hostility toward immigrants today, toward Mexicans, for example. You see that in the long history of racism, not only in the South, but throughout the country. And this still is a dominant pattern in our country. Now, how did the planners do this? How did they change the whole way that whites looked at their society? Well, they made poor whites feel superior. Racial identity replaced class identity. And blacks were treated as fundamentally different from whites. Here are some examples of how they pulled that off. The slaves were branded so that they could easily be, separated, seen as different, seen as the other. Sex was banned between blacks and whites. They didn't want a blurring of the lines between the two groups. Clergymen were prohibited from baptizing slaves. Now, initially, Christians could not be enslaved, but this was changed so that, even if you were baptized, you were still at risk of being enslaved. And by the 1680s, all blacks were considered slaves just by the color of their skin unless they could prove that they were free. Now, if this theory is correct, then we should see a dramatic increase in the number of slaves in Virginia. And now we have numbers here from Historical Statistics of the United States. It's a publication of the Census Bureau, who went back and did colonial statistics to the best of their ability, even though the census didn't begin until after independence. So they have numbers for black people, but almost all of them were slaves. Okay, now here's what it shows. In 1670, before Bacon's Rebellion, only 5.7% of residents of Virginia were black. Then we had Bacon's Rebellion, and by 1700, 28% were black. The number of blacks, almost all slaves, rose from 2,000 to over 16,000. By 1750, the percentage of blacks / slaves in Virginia was up to about 44%, over 100,000. And by the time of the American Revolution, it had risen to 220,000. So the numbers we have support this theory very dramatically. Now let's summarize here. Why the change from indentured servitude to slavery? I've given you one of the reasons here, and that is the fear that the planters had of former indentured servants arising from Bacon's rebellion. But there were other reasons as well. The Royal African Company traded in slaves, and they broke up in 1698. So, with more competition because of the laws of supply and demand, the price of slaves declined. Now, the price of indentured servants at the same time was going up because England's economy was doing better, and it was hard to attract people who would voluntarily go to Virginia because the word had gotten out that this was not a very good deal or a very good place for a servant to live. Also, those who did enter indentured servitude were more attracted to Pennsylvania because the opportunities were better there. The chances for getting their own land, for example, were better in Pennsylvania. Now, the life expectancy for everyone also improved, so that made slaves a better investment. If you were going to uh, undertake the cost of bringing a slave from Africa to Virginia, which cost more than a servant, and that slave or servant, were to die within 3 or 4 years on average, let's say as an example, then slaves would not be such a good deal. But if they were going to live for 20, 30 years after you brought them, then you would get more labor, whereas with the servants, you'd still only get the 4, 5, 6, 7 years or so of labor. But for the slaves, you'd get most of a lifetime of labor. And not only that, they would have the opportunity to have children, and then those children could be slaves for your children, and on and on and on. Has been a summary of a very important process that went on in early Virginia.